Hi, my name is Steve Milder. I'm a historian by training. I teach in the Department of European Languages and Cultures at the University of Groningen. But for the next several years, I'm going to be here at the Carson Center, where I'm working on a new project on German climate politics. And that's what I'm going to present about today, the making of Green Germany, the emergence of climate politics in the 80s and 90s. This presentation is about a project that, as I said, is just at its earliest stages, so I'm really looking forward to the chance to present this research, but I also want you to know that this will be more a presentation sort of the project as it's developing than findings, because those will come in time. So I've divided the talk that I'll give today into 4 parts. I'm going to start with a short introduction and talk about how we tend to see climate change as a problem and how a historical approach might change the way that we think about it. And then I want to talk about the specific case that I'll be studying, that of Germany and the emergence of climate politics there in the mid-80s and 90s. I start by giving a little bit of historical context, and then I want to talk about 4 examples, 4 ways in which climate was taken up into politics in Germany in the 80s and 90s, and then I have just some very brief conclusions at the end. I want to start by talking a little bit about climate change and how we think of it as a problem. I think, as you all know, as you're all aware, climate change can be a very difficult problem to grasp. The scope is enormous. The time frame on which it's unfolding is also huge, right? It's been going on for a while, taking shape for quite a long time, and its effects will continue long into the future. And I think for these reasons, scholars tend to describe the problem as something that's so big that it's practically unique. As one handbook on climate change politics puts it, climate is perhaps the most profound challenge ever to have confronted human social, political, and economic systems. In comparison with this sort of portrayal, other complicated problems like ensuring peace around the world, feeding all of humanity, promoting public health, all seem no match for climate change. So I want to start today in this introduction by just talking a little bit about what it means for us to think of climate change in this way. And then I want to present an alternative approach based on the history of the problem and efforts to deal with it. 2 common, if rather different, ways of thinking about such an overwhelming problem are, on the one hand, solutionism, the idea that basically technical fixes of one form or another can be applied. These could range, in the case of climate change, from carbon trading schemes to geoengineering, right? So big and small, but the idea is nonetheless basically that we can continue living in the way that we do, but we're going to make a few tweaks that will fix the problem. And this sort of approach is exemplified by Paul Hawken's 2017 book, Drawdown, which lists 100 climate solutions and ranks them in terms of their cost and the total atmospheric carbon reduction that they would generate. On the other hand, we could think about this enormous problem and say, okay, we need to take actually exactly the opposite approach. Rather than minor tweaks, we need to transform the way that we live. We need to change the social and political order in which we are all living. And that sort of approach is, of course, exemplified by Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, where she argues that resolving climate change or taking serious action on climate change is all but impossible within a capitalist economic system. Now, these perspectives both focus on future responses. They're less concerned with the way that we've tried to address the problem of climate change in the past. And to some extent, that's for good reason, right? The problem is only getting worse. But nonetheless, I think that taking a historical approach and looking at the way that efforts to address the problem of climate change have been developed in context can help us to see how those approaches developed and to show how they've actually been part of politics writ large throughout the period that we've been grappling with this issue, and that they don't exist either as just minor tweaks or as changes that are so dramatic that they can't fit within the system that we live in today. Now, of course, we could look at climate change policies in any number of countries or places around the world and learn quite a lot from that. I'm going to be focusing on Germany, and the reason for that is that in the mid-2010s, so midway through the last decade, Germany seemed to have achieved a global reputation as Green Germany, a champion of renewable technologies, a country that took a leading role in international negotiations on climate, a country building a new green economy, a country where nuclear energy was on its way out, not to mention where trash sorting and recycling are developed, where public transportation is in all of the major cities with a powerful Green Party. One historian even suggested that Germany could be referred to as the greenest nation. Now, in large part, this reputation is based on actions and policies that developed out of approaches to environmental protection that gained steam in the 80s. And that's exactly the time that the climate change debate reached the political mainstream in Germany and elsewhere in the world. So I want to finish up this introduction by very, very briefly giving you sort of a thumbnail history of the early approach to climate change as a political problem and how that discussion came to then West Germany in the 1980s. I think many of you know that climate change started to become better understood during the Cold War, particularly on account of Ralph Keeling's data of carbon in the air at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. That data became the basis for this, what you see here, the so-called Keeling curve that shows the tremendous increase in carbon dioxide in the air throughout the post-war period, so that when his research began in 1958, there were around 313 parts per million. And, well, recently the number has grown to well over 400. This research was deeply imbricated in its Cold War context, concerns about nuclear testing, competition between the superpowers for scientific achievement pushed on this kind of big-scale research. But by the 1980s, this context in which this research was developing started to shift a little bit. A series of international conferences that took place in Austria and in Italy brought the discussion of climate change, climate science into public consciousness in new ways, because the scientists started to talk about the climate not just in terms of data on the parts per million of carbon in the air, but also on what that would mean for sea level rise, for temperature, and they also began to talk about to advocate policies that might need to be taken in order to do something about this. And this approach provoked a political response. Governments proposed in the late 80s that rather than letting independent scientists run the show, it was time to set up, to get government scientists involved in this, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, was developed out of these discussions. And of course, through these international discussions, climate became an issue of national debate as well. And this is where I think we can shift the discussion to the beginnings of climate politics in West Germany, where the issue was very quickly absorbed into parliamentary politics. Environmental matters have been gaining pride of place in German politics in the 80s through debates about nuclear energy and acid rain, through the emergence of the Greens. And so climate change was formally taken up within the Bundestag, the federal parliament, in 1987, by a committee of inquiry, which comprised 11 members of parliament and 11 scientists, who included Paul Crutzen, the meteorologist who later won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and who's credited with popularizing the term Anthropocene. And this high-profile committee studied the issue for 3 years. It released a number of reports, and its final report, released in 1990, which you can see the cover of and a graph from here on the slide, called for dramatic reduction of carbon emissions by 30% by 2005, already in 1990. Now, the government basically accepted these findings and agreed that it was time to do something, but before much had really been done, other matters came to the fore. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But what my research project is aimed to look at, and what I want to get at, is how this debate was starting to unfold. Once the issue had been launched onto the national stage, what sorts of approaches were developed? What ways did German politicians and citizens start to think about climate change as a problem and what should be done about it. So in the time remaining today, I'm going to first talk about the historical context in which these sorts of ideas unfolded, and then give you a few examples of these ideas to look at. Now, I don't mean to give some sort of history lesson here. I think you know quite a bit about what happened around 1990 with the end of the Cold War, but I do want to very briefly touch on a few ways that the transformation of Germany, of Europe, and of the world affected climate politics around 1990. Now, of course, for Germany, the end of the Cold War was a time of tremendous transformation. The opening of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and then reunification in 1990 completely changed the context of German politics. There was a new place for Germany on the global stage, for reunified and sovereign Germany, but also there was widespread concerns about what German resurgence might mean for Europe and for the world. And at the same time, in the very concrete context of climate politics, the absorption of the former East German states into West Germany, which is how the reunification took place, meant that Germany's CO2 emissions basically transformed overnight, because all of a sudden the former eastern states, which had been heavily dependent on highly polluting lignite coal for most of their energy, were added to Germany's carbon balance. So in terms not only of Germany's role in the world, what was important in German politics, but also the physical conditions of climate politics in Germany, this was a big shift. Now, of course, at the same time, as the Cold War was unraveling and Germany was reunifying, Europe was also undergoing a transformation. In the 1980s, there was big progress after a period of stagnation towards the creation of ever closer union in Europe, particularly towards the creation of the Common Market with the Single European Act in 1987, and in 1992 with the Treaty of Maastricht, the EU was formed. And these developments also shaped climate politics and the framework in which they were unfolding in a number of ways, not least insofar as progress towards the creation of the Common Market meant deregulation of energy markets in Germany, which completely changed the context in which policies having to do with renewable energies developed. And of course, also in the sense that the EU took on an increasingly important position in environmental regulation within the member states and in representing the member states in international climate negotiations. And of course, it wasn't just in Germany or Europe that things were changing. On an even bigger scale, the end of the Cold War meant that international relations and a set of premises about the way that the world works were changing. And you can see here, on the one hand, US President George Bush declared the emergence of a new world order in which countries in East and West, North and South would work together. On the other hand, the philosopher Francis Fukuyama spoke of the end of history, a period in which basically global acceptance of liberal democracy had replaced the ideological struggles that had characterized politics in the last 100 years. And for him, the sorts of problems that would now characterize new politics were things like the solving of technical environmental issues. So both in sort of this context of a global openness to new cooperation around the world, of teamwork, and also in the sense that the arena of politics, the focus of politics was changing, this post-Cold War period was an important context for the emergence of climate politics. So I've talked a little bit about this context, and now what I would like to do is talk about four particular ideas that started to develop, four ways in which climate became part of German politics in this time. And these what I'm calling case studies are four separate ideas, but they're quite interlinked, and what we're going to see through them is ways in which Germany's new green image started to emerge at this time. The first subject that I'd like to talk about is the idea of a green economy, and with each of these I want to mention a little bit about how they feed into the way we perceive climate today and seek to solve it today. And I think you're familiar with the idea of a Green New Deal. It's got many variations, but in principle it's an idea about using economic growth to combat climate change. making green jobs that will save the economy at the same time as they mitigate climate change. And in a lot of ways, this sort of thinking has its roots in the 1980s. The Brundtland Report popularized the concept of sustainability in the late 80s all around the world, but particularly in West Germany, ideas about combining economy and environment and ecology were taking hold. The early 80s saw the emergence of ecological modernization theory, developed in particular by scholars at the Berlin Social Science Research Center. And they wanted to end the perceived dichotomy between ecology and economy by showing how technological advancement and smart planning could actually be used to harmonize economic growth and environmental improvement. And during the 80s, both major parties, the Social Democrats on the center left and the Christian Democrats on the center right, developed new rhetoric to reflect this idea, to try to make economic growth and environmental protection one and the same. You can see this kind of approach in this ad from 1985 on the slide for the Christian Democrats, which proclaims basically that Chancellor Kohl's path to success is going to continue. And one way that this is going to affect German citizens is that tax cuts for unleaded gas and for low-emission cars are going to make this economic growth pay off for all citizens at the same time as they work together to protect the environment. The Social Democrats also adopted similar kinds of ideas at this time. They took up the idea of decoupling, the idea basically that you could have continued economic growth without having continued energy use, and this also in the 1980s. So we see a growing intertwining of growth and environmental protection amongst the triumph of the capitalist West in the Cold War, this time of ascendancy of neoliberal ideas. And these changes raise some interesting questions about whether these sort of approaches to environmental policy suggest that the environment was a field where there was an end to the divide between left and right, where both sides of the political spectrum adopted neoliberal, market-driven approaches to environmental problem solving. And these are some of the questions that I'm going to pursue with my research into this area. Now, another important German approach to solving climate also emerged in the 80s, and that's the feed-in tariff. I'll explain what that means in just a minute if you haven't heard about it before. Of course, the growth of renewable energy production has come to be seen as the centerpiece of German climate policy, of its so-called Energiewende, or energy transition. And in the 1980s, renewable energy was hardly widely developed anywhere, but Germany certainly was not at the forefront of renewables development. So by the late 1980s, advocates of solar energy who were trying to figure out what to do, how to get this new source of energy to take off, switched tacks. They thought, okay, it's not worth pursuing state subsidies anymore. The development of solar energy should really be pushed forward by the market with one kind of tweak. What we need to get things started is a guaranteed cost-covering rate paid by the utilities to producers of solar energy. So that's the feed-in tariff, the idea that you would be paid an amount that makes your investment in solar energy worthwhile for the energy you produce. And they said, if we take this one small step, we're going to basically create a market for photovoltaic panels. This is going to lead to mass production, and it's going to lead to a decrease in cost for photovoltaic panels, and they'll be cheap enough to put up all over the country. This idea didn't get very far at the national level in the 80s, but it was developed locally, and citizens were deeply engaged in municipal fights to get municipal utilities to pay these rates for this energy, and they succeeded in a number of cities. And part of their success had to do with the fact that the push towards the common market in Europe was leading to deregulation of energy and causing Germany also to change some of its policies about what energy could be sold into the grid. So we can see here a really interesting connection between local debates about what active citizenship meant, about how to solve these kinds of energy problems, whether the market was the right way to do it or state growth, but also the links between the local level and the European context. And of course, Lastly, we see once again the importance of growth, that is the growth of the renewable sector for plans to solve climate change. Now I've got another picture of Helmut Kohl here from the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development, the Earth Summit in Rio. And I think perceived leadership in international conferences and also through the example of meaningful environmental policies is perhaps one of the most essential reasons that Germany has this green reputation in the wider world. So what I think here too is interesting is that already in the 1980s, Chancellor Kohl was talking about his environmental policy in terms of making Germany a green pioneer in Europe. And a lot of his approaches to environmental problems had something to do with this. One could even look at the creation of the Ministry for the Environment, which Germany did relatively late, only in 1986 after the Chernobyl disaster, as in part a means of allowing Germany to better coordinate with other countries, with its European partners in matters of environment. Now there was a clear point person for environmental problems, the person who would be the one to talk with the environmental ministers in other countries. And of course, the politician who took up that role in 1987, Klaus Töpfer, also sort of epitomizes this climate diplomacy approach. He took an important part in planning the Rio Earth Summit, what this picture is from. And he later, in 1998, became the first German to hold a high-level leadership post at the United Nations as director of the UN Environmental Program. And so it's very interesting to see the way in which this environmental issue becomes a means of projecting German leadership into Europe and the world. And I think that raises some very interesting questions about how leadership in environmental policies, green leadership, might contrast with tensions that surrounded discussions about, for example, whether German troops should join foreign military deployments and general hesitations about Germany's new leading role in European and world affairs. So the last case study that I want to talk about is the discussions of energy futures, which were also part of a widespread public debate in the 80s. And of course, the nuclear phase-out that Germany is about to complete has also been perceived as one of the country's environmental bona fides at the same time as its drawn-out coal phase-out has increasingly come to tarnish its green image. And what's interesting is that we can see the roots of both of these, the dragging of the feet on coal and the relatively quick nuclear phase-out, we can see roots of both of those in the 80s, when discussions of energy futures became part of a public debate in Germany through the anti-nuclear struggle and the citizen or alternative research institutes that formed on account of that. These kind of discussions are maybe epitomized by this book, Energiewende from 1980, which was published by researchers at the independent Freiburg Öko-Institute. And it was concerned with a future of growth and prosperity without oil or uranium, as the subtitle says. So the idea was to try to make Germany energy independent, to have generous economic growth, but without any uranium or oil, and without much more coal than was being used. And if you look at this chart that I've taken, this graph that I've taken from the book for one of the energy futures it predicted, you can see that the amount of coal to be used remains approximately constant from the 1960s when this graph is starting. I know that those numbers are way too small for you to read, but until the future prediction well into the 21st century. So the idea was not so much about phasing out carbon emissions completely as it was about using some conservation and some renewables to replace dependence on nuclear energy or foreign oil. And these kind of debates, of course, have shaped some of Germany's approaches to energy politics today. And so there's some interesting questions that come up here about how this anti-nuclear debate, societal debate, and also the societal debate on nuclear energy, and the emergence of small, independent, citizen-led research institutes shifted ideas about Germany's energy policy. So these are some of the things that I'm going to be looking at and some of the questions that I'm going to approach. As I've mentioned, this research is just at its outset. I'm looking forward to getting started in the archives as soon as that becomes possible again. But I want to just, by way of conclusion at this point, talk about a few things that I think are already apparent to me. And hopefully I've been able to show you in the presentation. For one thing, the tremendous changes brought about by the end of the Cold War, by German reunification and European integration, shaped Germany's initial approach to climate politics and thus have kind of stand at the core of its green image today. Ideas about protecting the climate, as we've seen, were enmeshed in discussions of energy futures and economic growth, but also of international leadership and active citizenship. And so I think that looking at how the issue of climate change has been addressed historically in the past can help us to rethink some of the assumptions that underpin our approaches today and remind us about how that problem has been perceived in relation to broader political debates and how those debates have shaped the ways that we still think about climate change and try to solve it today. So thanks a lot for listening to the talk, and I really look forward to the chance to discuss the project with you in the questions and answers afterwards. Thank you.